Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Newark Public Library, welcome. I'm Tom Ankner, the supervising librarian in charge of Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center here at the library. We are always excited to host events by the Newark History Society, and we are delighted to be partnering again with NJPAC. Just to take care of some housekeeping items, please help yourself to some food in the back if you haven't already. The food is being generously provided by the Newark History Society. We ask that people hold their questions or comments until after the presentation tonight. We will take questions from people here in the library as well as those of you viewing the program remotely. We will get to as many as possible after the program. Thank you.
He was so fast, I wasn't ready. Good evening, everyone. It is so good to see you here. My name is Aisha Marable, and I am from New Jersey Performing Arts Center, and I'm the third part of this partnership. NJPAC has had the privilege of partnering with Newark History Society for more than 7 years, and we're so excited that we could not do it without Newark Public Library. It has become greater and bigger. 1 + 1 is 5. So it's an exponential partnership. We so appreciate you being here, but most importantly, holding on to the history of Newark is so critical, not only for those who live in Newark, but those who love Newark. And our children and our children's children really need to have this understanding from whence they've come. So we want to appreciate you and the entire society and say thank you. We are all about engaged partnerships that really build legacy. And I am confident that what you have been doing over the years is helping us to build a legacy for Newark. Thank you so much for coming. And I hope to see you again. April 16th is our next gathering. Come on up, Tim Chris, our fearless leader.
Thank you, Aisha. There really is a good partnership between the library and NJPAC and the Newark History Society, and we're so grateful for their support. We're delighted that so many of you have been able to join us in person. This is almost a pre-COVID level crowd, so that's great to see, but also I expect a good number online through our Zoom webinar. If you are not on our mailing list or would like to join the Newark History Society, grab one of these forms that's on the stage up here, or go to our website, newarkhistorysociety.org, and find us that way. It's my privilege tonight to introduce Miles Thang as our speaker. When a group of us started the Newark History Society 22 years ago, it was a dream that there might one day be a second generation of scholars who could come and talk about and reflect on their research. And tonight, that's the case. Miles, I hope it's okay to say that I remember when you and your sister would come and sit often in the front row. We were meeting at the New Jersey Historical Societies in those days, but something took hold. Miles has done really tremendous work. Many of you know that he went to Columbia University for his undergraduate degree and then to Cambridge University for a master's degree. He's now a PhD candidate in urban history at the University of Michigan. And if you have not explored his website, it is amazing what he has posted on there. He has a remarkable ability of integrating historical and architectural analysis with the visual presentation of enormous amounts of data. And there are some tremendous projects on there, from Henry Ford's Model T assembly line to how the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire spread, to how the cathedrals of Notre Dame and Beauvais were built. So he is really doing tremendous work, and we're excited that his current research, his doctoral research, is about Newark and about the history of home ownership and the racial wealth gap in Newark. So let's welcome Miles as our speaker tonight.
Well, thank you, everyone. That's a very generous introduction, Tim, and it's an honor to be here. Today, when it comes to homeownership and the racial wealth gap, I think I have the challenge of talking about a complicated issue in just under an hour. And so to make something complicated simple is a difficult challenge. And so the presentation today is called An Island of Poverty in a Vast Ocean of Material Prosperity. The topic is taken from a speech by Martin Luther King in 1968, described the geography of segregation that was affecting the American city at that period of time. And I think it's an apt description of some of the inequalities that we see in Newark today. So here we look at the urban inequality by numbers of Newark today. And as we can see from the map, that Newark is a large Black and majority Hispanic city in one of the world's wealthiest regions. Newark is significantly more Black, significantly larger populations of Hispanics in Newark than in the rest of the region. And none of this is particularly surprising, but it's a product of historical circumstances. And I'd like to understand what some of those historical circumstances are that produce that kind of inequality. So here is the racial dot map of Newark Metro today. And we can see the majority white versus the majority non-white, and many of them majority Hispanic areas. And as we can see, there's clear spatial patterns of inequality in the metro region, with inner cities that tend to be majority Black and Hispanic, and outer suburbs that tend to be majority white. And some of these geographies are shifting, but these kinds of patterns have held constant over time. Okay, and here are the urban inequalities by the numbers. And so we see that Newark has median income 41,000 in a region that is significantly wealthier. And Newark has a poverty rate that is double that of New Jersey and double that of the nation. And that matches a pretty low high school graduation rate. So I think that property ownership and land ownership is often tied to wealth and the ability to generate wealth. And so a lot of these inequalities today are the product of historical circumstances. And here is the poverty rate by census tract. It looks pretty similar to the racial dot map. Again, it mirrors that description by Martin Luther King, An Island of Poverty in a Sea of Prosperity. And that is a quote by Martin Luther King from 1968. And that will be the title of the dissertation project. And here is another map. This is a map of race and home ownership in the current geography of Newark. As you can see, these maps are very similar. I could almost match the map on the left and the right, the map of majority Black areas and the map of majority homeowner areas. And the patterns are pretty neat and pretty visual. So I think what this reveals is the way in which homeownership is the product of state policies that make it easy for some groups or difficult for others. So in general, the pattern is that America has what I would call an urban rental market versus a suburban homeowner market. And that's the product of historical circumstances. For us to become a country of homeowners is a relatively recent phenomenon. For most of urban history, the largest population in Newark and nationally was renters. So there's a big movement from a nation where most people are renters into a nation where most people are homeowners, and where the majority of those homeowners tend to be people who are not of Hispanic ancestry or not of Black ancestry. And so the question is, how did this happen? And I think the answer has to do a lot to do with state policy. And so I'd like to answer this with 3 questions. And the first question is, what was the geography of Newark before home ownership? So what did it look like before everyone became a nation where the majority of people are homeowners? And the second question is the changes. So what kinds of policies allowed us to become a nation of homeowners, to move from a nation where almost everyone is a renter, white, Black, poor and large numbers of middle-class people alike into a country where significant numbers of the middle class and wealthy own homes. And then the third question looks at the world today and asks, how did increasing home ownership in the suburbs affect Newark? How did it produce the kinds of inequalities that we know today in Newark? And since owning property is a tool to build wealth, I think that understanding the history of home ownership is key to understanding kinds of racial inequalities. That the decision of who is allowed to have a home, who is not allowed to have a home, often results in certain kinds of wealth inequalities much later on in life. So we could think about what a home does. A home gives access to a better school districts, better quality parks, a more stable family life. Many of these kinds of things and privileges that we associate with home ownership. And so when we look at inequality, I think the inequality is often a product of patterns of home ownership. And that's the presentation today. So the first question is, what was Newark's 19th century urban geography before home ownership? Historically, and for most of its history, Newark was an industrial city of ethnic white immigrants from Europe. There's a massive demographic replacement in the 20th century from majority white to majority Black and Hispanic. And there's a limited Black population in 19th century Newark. That's largely before the Great Migration of Newark, when about 40% of Newark's population was foreign born, many of them immigrants from Europe. And so before the Great Migration, there's a different kind of geography to what we know Newark. And that Great Migration, starting with World War I, significantly changes the patterns of discrimination in the North. Because for the first time in Newark history, there's a very sizable Black population in the city. And there's massive demographic replacement. And so here are the dominant building typologies in Newark before the period of home ownership. There is the factory. About 40% of Newark's population was employed in factories. And many of them are kinds of manual workshops, garments, jewelry, textiles, many of them renters. So you work in the factory, you live near the factory, and you walk to work. Most of those people who work in the factories do not own homes. And then there is a series of tenements for renters. Newark never had the density of tenements of New York City, but did have significant numbers of tenement-type structures, usually 2 and 3 stories, in Jewish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, German neighborhoods. And then there were dozens of trolley lines linking these factories to the downtown urban core and the industries in that urban core. And then for a select number of Newarkers, there were some homeowners, Valentine, Kruger, the Newark famous family names that we know. But really, most Newark people do not own homes. Most of them were renters. And most of those homes were on the city edge, were homeowners, because we're living in a period before the automobile makes a suburb possible. We're living in a period where most people have to live near work, and you have to commute to work by trolley. And with that kind of urban density of Newark around 1900, it's really difficult to sustain home ownership. You need to be able to distribute people across the metro region at a low enough population density for home ownership to become accessible for large numbers of people. So here's a map of Newark in the 1890s. We see it's a dense city, clustered city. Those that are in red are the trolley lines. The little black line around the perimeter, those are the lines of the extent of the city limits. So we can see that in the 1890s and well into the 1910s, the majority of the region's population is contained within the city limits of Newark because there are few homeowners, most people are renters, and most people must live near work for the jobs in downtown. And so here we have on the map, we called out the small numbers of homeowners, some in the North Ward, some around the parks, Lincoln Park, few in Military, but really not very many. And so we have public transit link the 4 corners of downtown. There's about almost 1,000 factories within that 10-block area of 4 corners. And they're all linked to tenements on the city edge. And there's no cars. And the spread of transport and the extent of the trolley lines limited urban growth to the areas near downtown. And there's a dense urban form. Less than 10 square miles accessible to downtown by walking or by public transit. So it's a small and a dense city. You can't really be a homeowner. It's cost prohibitive. And there's few homeowners. And there's also few opportunities to build single-family freestanding homes unless you're pretty wealthy. And so the second question is, how did we become a nation of homeowners? Historically, most Americans were never homeowners. And this is a pretty recent development, I'd say, in American urban history. And so here we see the percentage of the US population living in cities and suburbs. And we can see that the population becomes more urban over time. We go from a country where most people are in rural areas. Most people own their own farmsteads, the image of the frontier kind of yeoman farmer, into this modern kind of city where there's a moment where people move to cities, become renters in cities. They have to live near downtown in cities. You're industrializing as a country. You're urbanizing as a country. And then there's this period where you spread out. And so US is majority rural nation. Most people are landowners by the time of the Civil War. There you go. And then the US becomes a majority urban nation where most people migrate to cities. And then we become a majority suburban nation where most people have migrated from those cities to those suburbs as homeownership opens up to the majority of the population then that in the 1920s was within the city limits. So let's take a kind of a walk through what these patterns of social mobility look like. So Newark has had different kind of patterns of immigration through time. And so we have certain groups, the Germans, they come here earliest to Newark, just after the Civil War. They come to Newark, they live here, they migrate, and they leave. They migrate to the suburbs. We have other groups in the third generation. We have the Blacks who arrive in Newark. And so there's different generations who move to Newark. You can think about Newark as kind of a revolving door. The immigrant groups come from Europe. They live in the city for a few decades, and then they migrate to the suburbs. And so the Germans, the Italians, Jewish, other earlier immigrant groups, they arrive in Newark, they stay for a while, they leave. There's certain kind of patterns that I think make the Great Migration different in Newark. That means that they arrive here and they stay for longer before leaving. And so there are certain patterns that confine the city to being the way it is today. And so the Blacks, Black families arrived in Newark, they worked in tenements, and they left. And there's a shrinking industrial economy at the same moments that the Black population arrives in Newark. And then there's a fourth migration today of Hispanic populations. And so here we have a map of different homeownership rates evolving through time. On the lower map is the homeownership rate in Newark over time from the period 1900 to today. It's fluctuated pretty low between 10% and 25%. We have the homeownership rate above that in New Jersey.
We have the Great Depression, and before that time, most people are not homeowners, most people are renters. We have a significant period from the 1950s to the 1970s, this kind of golden age of mid-century prosperity. And that's a period of significant growth, of increase in homeownership for the region and for the United States, but not for Newark. And so Newark is in a lot of ways locked out of that period of mid-century prosperity, where the nation goes up and Newark goes down. And that's a characteristic story in American history replicated in dozens of other cities. And then since the 1970s and 80s, we have stagnating homeownership both in New Jersey and nationally. The key period to examine in Newark is that period of post-war prosperity, the 1950s roughly to the 1970s. And so fundamentally, we have two kinds of markets. We have a home finance for white suburbs. We have three pictures right here of Bamberger's and Paramus and the migration of both jobs and businesses to the suburbs, followed by the migration of people to those suburbs. And then we have home finance and the opportunities or lack of homeownership opportunities in cities like Newark. And that's that period from 1950 to 1970 when America transitions from a majority rental nation to majority homeowner nation. There was a low homeownership rate in Newark, and homeownership rate was really beyond reach for most Americans.
And so when if we on the top by the top, we see what that looks like. When you would try to get a loan to buy a house, you'd have a very large down payment, a loan, and then after the period of that loan is paid off, you have a large balloon payment. And so today, when you kind of become a homeowner, you have amortized payments that are divided by the length of the loan. You pay a reasonable amount at a time. And that little down payment, 10 or 20%. What happens is that before the Great Depression, that was the large down payment, maybe a 5-year loan on short terms, and then a balloon payment at the end where you pay off the remainder. And so what happens after the Great Depression is that we have changes here where you pay a small amount down payment and a 20 to 30-year loan with the principal of the loan plus the interest. So it's easier to become a homeowner because the annual amount that you're paying is less. But these kinds of loans that were subsidized for homeownership were given only to certain kinds of areas. And so who was given these loans, who was not? Typically, you have suburban areas. You can get these kinds of loans. There are significant studies such as the Case for Reparations by the scholar Ta-Nehisi Coates. And he looks at what home finance looked like in the 1930s and 1940s in Chicago. Ta-Nehisi Coates says that because these kinds of urban areas were not given the loans and the tools for home finance, what happens is that the terms of finance in the cities were a lot closer to the terms of finance that had been given before the Great Depression. And so we have an older kind of finance in cities, that more predatory kinds of lending for the kinds of urban communities that were excluded from suburban home ownership. Many kinds of urban banks and renters and companies would not rent to or sell homes to people in those cities. And those terms are not nearly as generous. So you have more in down payment, you have a shorter loan, you have hidden fees. These are the kind of patterns that Ta-Nehisi Coates describes. Whereas in the suburban areas, you could get a generous loan with a small down payment, a 20 to 30-year loan that you can easily pay off. And so this is the kind of a point where I think we can start to see those two lines diverging. And so earlier in time, before those innovations in home finance, the homeownership rate in New Jersey suburbs and New York City are closer to each other. Over time, when those kinds of loans are given to suburbs, when it becomes easier to become a suburban homeowner through time, those rates diverge over time. And so we have the suburbs and the United States that go on one path of homeownership. And we have, these are green line suburbs. And then the other path is that of cities like Newark. And so I think that we need to look at this divergence over time, where at mid-century, there's both prosperity, but also inequality. There's mid-war prosperity and there's inequality. So what's benefiting are these suburban areas and the places that are being hurt and harmed by mid-century by deindustrialization, by population flight, by population loss, by the challenges of homeownership are cities like Newark. And so it's a time of growing inequality. If you look at the 1920s in Newark, I mean, most Italians or ethnic immigrants to Newark at the time, many of them are homeowners, but really it's a much lower rate than it is today. And so the third question is, how did increasing the homeownership in suburbs affect Newark? So I think we can kind of understand this whole pattern here as maybe something like a magnet, that we have suburban areas where there's generous finance to become a homeowner. There's many such suburban tract homes being erected in mid-century. And there's also many highways in those suburbs that make it easy to live in the suburbs and commute to downtown. We can kind of see these things as magnets that are pulling people from the city to the suburb, at least those who can afford to leave the city, leaving behind in a city like Newark, a city that's increasingly poor. And so we look at Newark in the 1910s and 1920s. And it's a city where many wealthy people tend to live in downtown Newark, the Ballantines, the Krugers. But by mid-century and over time, they live farther and farther away from Newark. And the revenue and their investment in the city and the amount that they pay in property taxes goes to those suburbs rather than to the city. And so the policy that made this possible, the policy in the 1930s, beginning of the 1930s, that was used to determine eligibility to receive these kinds of loans was called redlining. This is the Homeowners Loan Corporation map, but the real maps are by the Federal Housing Administration. And they were used to assess neighborhoods, to rank them on a scale of A, B, C, or D, as A being best for investment, B being still desirable, C being declining, and D for hazardous. And so the federal government sent realtors to go from neighborhood to neighborhood to class each type of neighborhood by if they thought it was hazardous to investment or beneficial to investment. And so when we look at this map, there are certain kinds of patterns. We'll notice that on the map, almost every single urban area is redlined, and almost every single majority of suburban areas are the blues and the yellows and the greens. And so there's a pattern where the federal government encourages suburban development. And that's Newark, that's pulled apart right in the middle. And so here's a diagram of Newark during that period of redlining. And as you can see from this map of Newark, not a single neighborhood was green-lined. All of them are pretty low density. There's a little bit of the blue in Vailsburg, a little bit in Forest Hill, a little bit in Weequahic, but nothing in green. Mostly those neighborhoods in blue on the map were neighborhoods where there are already large numbers of homeowners, and where the federal government wanted to encourage continued homeownership, and when there were opportunities in those neighborhoods for homeownership. But all of the red area was where it was very difficult. And so those realtors would go neighborhood to neighborhood, would assess the neighborhood, and they would map it on the map, and they would draw a description of why they think the neighborhood was classed as red or green or yellow or blue. And so here is the map of downtown Newark, and that red area, the D4 zone, was described as a place with considerable demolition and boarding up. There is a lot of sales have been made to undesirable groups. It is an area of minimum values and useful only to those in the lowest income brackets who need to be in walking distance of work. And so this was a time when downtown Newark was described as undesirable long during the period of the Great Migrations, in the moment kind of that demographic transition. So the neighborhood becomes undesirable going into the 1930s and 40s. And so here's, again, a picture of that diagram, justifying or trying to justify why they thought downtown Newark should be redlined. And so we have, to give some of the reasons, they say that the neighborhood is largely Italian and has a large Black population, as you can see from line C, and they describe it as infiltration. So pretty frequently in this period of time, neighborhoods that were in transition, neighborhoods with large numbers of immigrants, were described as neighborhoods as infiltration. The arrival of those immigrants are described as an infiltration in the neighborhood. And there are certain kinds of things that are seen as desirable in a neighborhood. So things, for instance, like higher homeownership rate, low numbers of immigrants, a small Jewish population, a small Black population, certain things like longer length of tenancy, wealthier neighborhoods. All of these factors are used to determine eligibility for if that neighborhood is desirable or undesirable, and if people in the neighborhood should be given the opportunities for homeownership, or if federal subsidies should be directed in that kind of direction. And so here we have another diagram. This is a map of where the Black population lives in Newark in the year 1940, based on the 1940 census tract. And as we can see from this map, there's still sizable populations of white people, of European immigrants in these cities.
And we see that there's concentrations of Black communities in the 4 or 5 largest: the Old Third Ward in Newark, Bergen in Jersey City, Harlem in New York City, Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York. And then there's 2 other pretty visible Black enclaves in the 1940 census. One of them is Rikers Island, which speaks to the already high incarceration rate among Black people in the 1940s, so large that it shows up as its own census tract on the 1940 census. And then the other one is South Jamaica.
And on the next map, we see the areas that were redlined. And it's interesting, I think, to compare these two maps. We see that almost every single neighborhood of any Black population was redlined. And also within Newark, there are sizable populations of Italian neighborhoods that were placed in a redlined area, but many of them were able to get loans, they were able to move around. And so the majority of the metro region of downtown Newark was in a redlined area, considered hazardous to investment. So we think about the year 1940 or 1950, when the federal government is building suburban tract developments, building highways to make it easy to move to the suburbs, demolishing mass transit systems that discourage people from living near downtown, when funding for new school districts are in suburbs, when the shopping malls are in suburbs, when advertising on television talks about suburban homeownership and the desires of being in the suburbs. There's these kind of magnets that are pulling people away from the city. So we can think about that earlier diagram when we thought about the waves of immigrants coming to Newark. The Black populations, the Italians, the Germans, the Jewish populations, they come to Newark, they use Newark as a tool for social mobility, and then they leave. And that's a different pattern than what Blacks in Newark and what other marginalized groups followed. They did not leave the center city. What was also happening at this time of the redlining is that there was the Great Migration, driven by fears of Jim Crow in the South, the industrialization of Southern agriculture, the mechanization of agriculture in the South, the switch in the South from an economy of cotton into an economy of other kinds of produce that required less labor. And so there's a massive movement of some 6 million African Americans from the South to the North, from places like Newark that are 10% white, 10% Black in 1910 to 50 and 60% Black by the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And so what happens is that many of these Blacks who arrive in Newark, many of them are moving into redline neighborhoods, and many of them are staying in these kinds of redline neighborhoods. And so redlining kind of earmarks certain kind of neighborhoods as low income, creates the incentive of a magnet that pulls people from urban areas to suburban areas, from the red line city into the green line suburb. And so the Black population is kind of entering Newark at this period of time, many of them into renter neighborhoods, low income neighborhoods, neighborhoods with few opportunities for home ownership, neighborhoods where there was maybe lower car ownership rates, lower home ownership rates. And so there's certain kind of patterns of inequality. At the same time, in mid-century, during this period of suburbanization, there was significant movement of industries from urban areas to rural areas. So for instance, federal subsidies encourage factories to relocate from Newark to the suburbs. And so then we think about where jobs are, and they increasingly start to move to the suburbs. So in the 1900s, many of those jobs in Newark, those good kind of industrial jobs, garment, sweatshops, factories, or car manufacturing in Detroit, they're in the city center. In mid-century, they start to move to the suburbs. And many of those suburbs were areas protected by something called a restrictive covenant. Now, a restrictive covenant is something that's written into the deed of a house that prohibits the sale of that house to a specific kind of group. So you can put a restrictive covenant on your deed that restricts the owner from, say, using it as a party house or something else. Or before the 1948, you could put on a restrictive covenant that restricted the sale of that house to someone of non-Caucasian ancestry, so someone of Jewish ancestry or someone of Black ancestry. Those policies were ruled illegal in 1948, but some of those policies kind of continued unofficially well into the 1950s and 60s. And so if we return to that earlier diagram with that kind of divergence of urban and suburban home ownership rates, even though restrictive covenants are ruled illegal in that period of 1940s, even though redlining is begun by the FHA, begun by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, kind of trickles off by the 1930s, they kind of set in place certain kinds of patterns of disinvestment in the urban core. And so we'll take a snapshot of how Newark kind of changes over that period of time. As you can see in Newark, there is significant population change over time. Newark was population almost 500,000 by the 1950s, and that's before the interstate highway comes into Newark. What the interstate highway allows is it allows people to work in downtown and live easily 40 or 50 miles away and to drive to work. When you are commuting to work by car, you have to live near downtown, and that produces certain kinds of residential patterns. And so the Black population of Newark was changing over time, starting with the Great Migration. And so what was driving the Black population at this time? There was racial violence in the South. That's one contributing factor. Other contributing factors are things like the mechanization of agriculture. You go from cotton, which is pretty labor intensive, to other kinds of fields that are less labor intensive. Certain kinds of labor-saving equipment and devices that push a rural population of tenant farmers into urban areas. And there's also the employment in urban factories, the promise of employment in these kinds of factories. And so there is also the desire for social mobility for a population that historically had been excluded from social mobility in the American South. So the Black population in Newark, in the American South, in the 1880s has a very difficult time with significant amounts of racial violence. And so these kinds of factors, these push-pull factors, push the Great Migration toward Newark. And so what's happening to the white population at that time? Many of them are leaving Newark. They're going to home ownership opportunities in the suburb. There is some element of white flight that encourages people to move from the urban areas to suburban areas. At the same time, the kind of counterfactual is the federal government creates these kinds of levers to encourage suburban home ownership. And so if you're living in the 1950s in Newark, you can afford a house, you would probably want to leave Newark at that time and move to a suburb where you can have a house. And so what was driving the population loss at that time? There's opportunities for home ownership in the suburbs. And there's also the assimilation of immigrants into American kind of suburban culture. So we look at Newark in the 1920s. There are sizable Jewish enclaves in the Old Third Ward, and there is sizable Italians in what is now the Columbus Homes. And certain kinds of these immigrant groups of these neighborhoods had self-reliance, their own institutions, churches, schools, German language schools. And gradually, as these groups assimilate into the mainstream, they don't really need those kinds of institutions anymore. They can move to the suburb. And so, for instance, by mid-century, the suburban Levittown was restricted to whites initially, but it was described at the time as kind of a melting pot for ethnic white Americans. That is, we have the diversity of Newark in the 1920s with immigrant groups and immigrant enclaves. They move to the suburbs, and in these kinds of suburbs, they kind of mix around, they mix together. In some ways, in the process, the US government frames this as a project that makes them American. There's a quote from, I think, either Herbert Hoover or Henry Ford in the Dearborn Independent in the newspaper saying that home ownership is the best defense against socialism, that you make someone a homeowner and their priorities will change overnight. Paying property taxes, to sending their child to school, to maintaining the home, to keeping up the driveway, and all these kinds of things. And so there's kind of a period, I think, in the 1950s where there's desires to assimilate groups into the suburban to promote social mobility into suburbs, and in some ways to, maybe this is conspiracy, to avoid fears of kind of unrest and labor unrest. And so many of these entire generations graduate from the urban rental market to the suburban homeownership market on the paths toward homeownership created by the federal government, quite literally on the bands of those highways. And the highways enable this kind of population loss. To live in suburbs and commute by car. That's not a reality of the 1920s. And it's really difficult in the 1920s if you're working by trolley. There's also desire to avoid Black population and the fear of Black neighbors. That is driving some of the population flight in Newark. But I think there's also the kind of counterfactual that if we think about the federal policies of the 1930s that would class any interracial neighborhood, any mixed-rate neighborhood as red, as hazardous to investment, and any majority entirely white neighborhood as green and safe for investment, there's kind of a penalty toward living in a diverse neighborhood in the 1950s, a penalty to living into a mixed-race kind of neighborhood. And so there's the kind of question of how much is one willing to pay in terms of lower quality services to accept diversity. And I think there's certain kind of policies here or practices here where federal policy discourages that kind of diversity, as well as real estate policies that associate those diverse neighborhoods with certain kinds of undesirable qualities, as we saw from an earlier map of Newark that classed all of downtown Newark as too diverse or too low income. And so we look at the history of Newark. There is English immigrants in the early 1840s who arrive in Newark, Irish, Italians, and Germans. Later, so different periods of Europeans, they come to Newark at different periods of time. And so different generations, they all assimilate into American culture. And then there's that kind of immigration act called the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. And fundamentally, that restricted immigration from Europe. It made it really difficult for more Europeans to come over to the United States because some of them, particularly Jewish and Italian, were seen as undesirable for American culture. And so there's that kind of moment where immigration policies change. There's also the period of American isolationism after World War I. America's afraid to enter World War II. America wants to be kind of independent of the world. And so there's kind of certain xenophobic policies that restrict further immigration from Europe. And it's at that moment in time where Northern employers look toward the American South to find jobs to fill Northern factories. And so there's declining white migration due to immigration from Europe. There's World War II. The nation is kind of closed off from the world. And at that point in time, there's a significant increase in the Black population of Newark that coincides with changes in immigration policy. And then there is the 1967 rebellion. And so as you can see, the 1967 rebellion kind of comes at the tail end of really what's happening here. The Black population had already grown pretty large. The white population was really in the process of leaving the city already. And so 1967 is kind of like the bookend of policies and practices that had started in the 1930s. It doesn't initiate white flight, it accelerates white flight. It kind of continues a practice that had been kind of ongoing for decades. And so what's happened since the 1960s and 70s is that we have both a flight of the white population from Newark to homeowner areas, as well as some Black population lost from the city as well. And so we can talk both about a racial wealth gap between whites and Black populations. We can also talk about wealth gaps within a certain kind of community. So within Black communities, where are wealthier Black communities concentrated, where are poorer Black communities concentrated? I'd say that in the 1950s in Newark, before the end of discrimination in lending, wealthy and poor Blacks alike tended to live in downtown Newark. You couldn't move to a suburb even if you wanted to. What happens, and that's I think really interesting in the historical record, is that when segregation is passed and desegregation goes on, is that starts to become a movement of middle class and wealthier Blacks to suburban areas. And so as these suburbs become more diverse, they leave behind a city that is increasingly poor and increasingly Black. And so we can speak about different kinds of wealth gaps within different kinds of census groups, but also wealth gaps within a single census group. And so we can look at Newark of the 1920s, and there would probably be a different kind of income group, would say, between immigrants of German ancestry and English ancestry versus immigrants of Italian and Jewish ancestry. So even within each of these census categories, there are certain kinds of hierarchies. And so Newark today is both a Black city and a poor Black city. Now you look at some suburbs like Maplewood or Montclair, there are pretty diverse suburbs and sizable Black populations there, but they tend to be wealthier. And that's what we're talking about with Black flight. And what's happening here is we see the impact of highway construction on Newark. There are some studies which Professor O'Flaherty shared with me that consider the counterfactual of how large would Newark have become had there been no highway construction to enable suburbanization. The estimate is that without highway construction, I think we could see Newark's population grow about 8% or so to much larger than it became by the 1970s. And with highway construction, there was a projected population loss of 18%. And so I think what's really happening here is that a large amount of this population loss is due to changes in transit and changes in transit mobility. And it's interesting looking at Newark, the 1947 master plan predicts that by the 1970s, Newark would have a population 500,000 and maybe 600,000 by the 1980s and 1990s. And that's taking the image of the 1940s before interstate highways, projecting it forward. And so that 1947 model from the master plan by Harlan Bartholomew kind of interpolated Newark population growth, not considering the impact of highway construction. And so we think about the impact of Interstate 280, Interstate 78. Interstate 280 displaces about 10,000 people, Interstate 78 for approximately another 8,000 people. Many of them homeowners. That significantly reduces both the number of homes in Newark and the number of rateables. That is the number of properties in Newark that contribute to the property taxes in the city. So we think about hollowing out of the city through time. We think about urban renewal projects that displace some 40,000 people in Newark, the port and the airport, the infrastructure projects, the highways that cover a good amount of Newark surface area. And collectively, these kinds of projects reduce the tax area available for the city to fund city services like schools, fire, police, and all the rest. And it creates this kind of a cycle where how do you balance your budget? You don't have the tax base both of land and of wealthier people to kind of subsidize these kinds of taxes. At the same time, that suburban homeownership has pulled away both the most socially mobile and the wealthiest people, leaving behind a majority low-income kind of city. And so we see the number there in the middle, the 359 is what we think the population of Newark would have been something close to of the percentage of population loss, maybe attributable to highways alone. Some other things there are a population loss attributable to other things, natural population loss, population change, changes, say, in refrigeration that allows you to live farther from work and go to the supermarket less often, maybe live in an area where you want to live. And so we have this period, this splitting from that early diagram where the homeownership rate in Newark looks a lot closer to the nation, to the period now where the homeownership rate in Newark is 23% or 28% in a nation where the homeownership rate is well above 60%. And so there's a splitting of a diverse and multiracial city, multi-ethnic city, as a walkable city with trolleys, into a city that's more spatially divided. And so these gives you the set of 3 questions or so. The first one being, what was the Newark's 19th century urban geography before homeownership? Very few homeowners, mostly renters. The changes, so certain federal policies and real estate lobby policies, real estate industries lobbying the federal government for changes that encourage federal subsidies to suburban neighborhoods. And then we have the kind of contemporary inequalities and geographies today. I should note that the racial wealth gap has the closing of the racial wealth gap has kind of slowed. That at the time of the U.S. Civil War, the racial wealth gap was between 1 and 40. So freed slaves in 1865 are 1/40th as wealthy as average white Americans at the time. By the 1920s, that wealth gap narrows to about 1 to 7. And by the 1950s, it's about 1 to 6. And that's kind of where it's hovered today. And so it's the period of the closing of the wealth gap. And today, not just of its opening in some parts, but certain kinds of stasis. And so the conclusion, it's difficult. I think there's a lot of different kinds of factors here. There's redlining, there's home ownership, there's federal policy, there's state policy, there's subsidies to suburbs, there's highway construction, there is deindustrialization, there's the movement of factories away from New York to rural areas, there's changes in immigration policy, and there's this whole web of factors that contributed to New York becoming the relatively poor city that it is today. And so I think that one of the challenges here is that if this issue were simpler and easier to solve, it's ways in which some of these things here are the projects of racial prejudice. Other things are kind of knock-on effects. And so, for instance, something like a highway originally created out of animosity towards cities today can bring people and create suburban areas that are majority white and majority wealthy, independent of any prejudices of the people who live in those kinds of areas. So I think it's hard to pull these kinds of things apart. And so what does discrimination in lending look like today? There was a recent case in 2022 of Lakeland Bank that was fined $13 million for locating all of its branches outside of Newark and outside of majority Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. So the federal investigators, they created a dot map locating where all of the Bronx branches were located or not located, and none of them were located in Newark, and very few of the bank's customers were from the Newark community. And the federal government read that as evidence of discrimination. I think what's challenging here when talking about this kind of topic is that some of the language here has become more coded in time. That we can look at the 1930s redlining documents, and many of them are kind of explicit in what they're doing, what they're saying, and how they're saying it. They're saying that this group area is a Black neighborhood, we will not lend there. And it's kind of on its face explicit. What happens, I think, after the 1960s, when many of these policies are ruled illegal, is that things need to become, in some ways, more nefarious, or other ways more so-called kind of clever, that you need to find other kinds of explanations, other kinds of ways to describe it. So maybe words like school choice or freedom of choice, or maybe we're not putting these areas because we don't think they make good customers, or we're not putting a bank here because this area doesn't have much interest, or we're not putting a bank here because even if we put the bank here, the people wouldn't use our services. So there's ways which I think the language here has become more coded over time, and in other ways more difficult to talk about. That you can pull a document from the 1930s or the 1850s, and it says what it says. Today, that's more difficult. And so I think it's a complicated issue, and I'm approaching 15 minutes, so I'll close it. I'll open it up for questions, but I'd like to say that this kind of a project really wouldn't have been possible with all of you. I think Newark is a real inspiration in the sense that we have a nation of significant income inequalities and social injustices. And how do we begin to talk about these kinds of things if we don't look at the place that is a significant and real concentration of poverty and income inequality? And I think it's important to denaturalize the built environment. These assumptions that the world today is the way it's always been, that there are not alternative kinds of realities. We can look at Canadian cities that have more social mobility, parts in Europe or European cities where significant numbers of wealthy people live in those downtowns. And then we can look at American cities where they follow a different kind of pattern. And what I find both troubling and frustrating about Newark is I see this kind of moment of Newark in 1950 when there is some social mobility, when there's thousands of industries downtown, when there aren't highways, when the city is projected to be population 500,000 people. And then you fast forward 20 years later and the city follows a seemingly opposite trajectory. And so I think some of this history, much of this history isn't inevitable, and it can follow different kinds of paths. And I think that really encourages us to take ownership over that kind of thing today. So I'll throw it open for questions. I don't think I've answered all of what's happened here. It's a complicated issue, the multiple things, but I look forward to discussing it with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles, for that talk. You seem to hit most of the high points or the low points, as we would say. So I was at a symposium at Yale University on Saturday about the Italian neighborhood of Worcester Street. And I think the one thing we may have missed here that you touched on with the highway construction is the role of quote urban renewal. And the other thing I just wanted to say is the more I was sitting there hearing that talk about Worcester Square and the Italian neighborhoods and the Black neighborhoods of New Haven, is that Newark's story is unfortunately not unique in that regard. So if you could say a little bit more about like urban renewal policies and their effects.
I find urban renewal a complicated picture. That if you look at Newark in the 1950 master plan, the city planners are aware that there's population change. They're aware that there's deindustrialization, and they're aware that there needs to be certain kinds of federal policies to reverse that deindustrialization. That was one of the major things encouraging the federal government to clear about 100 acres for the campus of Rutgers and UMD&J and NGIT. This idea that we are becoming a more modern nation, a nation that's moving from industry to certain kinds of knowledge sector services. And for the nation to benefit from these kinds of services, we need to provide room for them in the cities that are low income, the cities that lack social mobility, and cities that are experiencing economic decline. So I really see urban renewal as one of the responses to fears of mid-century change and fears that by the 1950s, Newark had an aging housing stock, had an aging population, a declining school age population of children. So I think urban renewal is one of these ways that responds to fears of decline. But obviously what happens is that urban renewal disproportionately disadvantages certain communities within Newark. So at a time when 40% of Newark's population was Black, about 70% of those displaced by urban renewal were of Black. And so in a time when most of these urban renewal neighborhoods were majority renters, the landlords were compensated for the displacement of their lands, but the renters were not. And so we have kinds of a fracturing of urban neighborhoods. We have things like Interstate 280 that pulls apart the urban core, slices through the urban core, makes walkability more difficult. It's so hard to have a viable Main Street or a viable downtown if your city is cut in half by a highway and half the population has to walk across the highway to get to work or to get to a job. That encourages more people to drive. It also makes it hard to support certain kinds of downtown businesses. So I really see urban renewal as this mixed policy, a mixed bag policy that some part of it comes from good intentions, but it's also a tragedy of good intentions, a tragedy of the failure of public housing, a tragedy of the failure of many urban renewal projects. And I think sometimes certain kinds of university campuses have a responsibility as anchor institutions to promote social mobility. I really see that in the case of Rutgers or in the case of other institutions such as UMD&J, built on the lands taken from majority Black communities. And I think that these institutions owe the city something for that, for taking significant amount of ratables away and property tax base away to give back to the city. Yes, Linda Morgan.
Well, first of all, congratulations on a marvelous presentation midway through a PhD program. And for those who don't know it, Miles was appointed by the mayor to our central planning board. So his commitment to the city carries on even though he's a student in another state. So I thought you did a fantastic job. My question is about a prescriptive and a prospective view on some of the major policy issues that you're bringing up relative to state and federal policies that, and city policies too, that have been brought in through this administration, particularly for incentivizing additional housing production in transit-oriented
Yeah.
cities like Newark, Camden, Atlantic City, et cetera, but particularly in Newark. And that's at the federal level, the low-income housing tax credit, the Aspire program, which follows on ERG, and the transit hub policies. The fact that the housing authorities today, including Newark, can have incentives for home ownership for people who already are renting with voucher programs. I don't know if your thesis would include an evaluation of those programs, but what strikes me about them as someone in the development community is that they're really promoting, for the most part, more rentals downtown, perhaps because there hasn't really been a market for additional home ownership downtown, but the mayor cares about that, and land banking policies and others. I don't know, is there room in your thesis to look at where we are today prescriptively?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. The dissertation project will focus more on the historical than on the contemporary. But what I will say about downtown Newark is that I think more than anything, downtown Newark needs people, and it needs a lot of people to stay in the kinds of businesses that we need. You can look at downtown Newark in the 1930s. There's easily hundreds of businesses on Broad Street, and you can think about the size of the department stores on Broad Street, Bamberger's and Haynes, and how large an urban population do we need to sustain those kinds of businesses. So I think downtown really needs people. When it comes to homeownership opportunities, I think a key challenge is the Newark public school system and the quality of the public school system. That if you are socially mobile, if you can afford a home, chances are you would want to move to a home that's in a good school district. And so I think the challenge of Newark public schools is a real issue, that even if you own a home in Newark, the quality of public schools is questionable in other ways. And I think it's important to improve the quality of Newark public schools to incentivize homeownership in the city. Another thing that I think is important in downtown Newark is to provide housing units of a range of sizes, of a range of bedrooms. Some of the recent developments in downtown Newark are only 1 and 2 bedrooms. I think it's really important to encourage 2 and 3 bedroom apartments. So the kinds of apartments where people will have more children, or they can have children and continue to live in that apartment before moving to the suburbs. That would probably produce a lower price point for those kinds of apartments. You might be able to get more rental revenue from all studios than a mix of studios and 1 and 2 bedrooms. But I think that there should be federal subsidies and federal encouragement, or maybe tax subsidies, or certain ways to encourage larger units in downtown, or the size of apartments in downtown that are closer to what might be found in suburban areas. But I also think it's an issue of kind of a critical density and a critical mass, that Newark needs more middle-class people. Newark needs, I think, more wealthier people downtown. That's separate from gentrification. You can have that without displacement. And I think really Newark needs that to balance its tax base, and that to increase the diversity of income diversity in the Newark public school system, that we look at the school system. And I think what's really correlated to social mobility within schools is not just being able to go to school with more diverse peers, but being able to go to school with peers of different income groups, to learn from different income groups, to be able to go to college or to school or high school with children whose parents might themselves be college graduates or doctors or lawyers or have decent high-paid professions. And so I think that kind of diversity in the Newark public school system requires a diversity in homeownership opportunities and a diversity in the homeownership, in the kinds of units available, both rental and homeowner.
Miles, we're going to try to go questions here and questions from those who've joined online. And we have several, so it's going to be bouncing back and forth. From Guy Sterling, has the construction and growth of government buildings, hospitals, and Newark's universities impacted homeownership in the city?
It's a difficult question to answer. The interstate highways steered off a significant number of the homeownership opportunities and the homeowner units in Newark. Most of Interstate 78 cuts through a majority neighborhood. Many of them have the opportunities for homeownership, a neighborhood on the scale of Weequahic, as does Interstate 280, neighborhoods where you could conceivably, I think, fit a lot of homeowners in. They're not tenement neighborhoods, they're more neighborhoods of 2 or 3 kinds of units. When it comes to UMD&J and Rutgers, most of those units were inserted in neighborhoods of brownstones and tenements in their kind of urban core. So I wouldn't say that those projects reduced the number of homeowner opportunities, but they significantly reduced the housing stock available. And so Newark has the population that it does, but it has to provide services for a metro region of 1 million easily. So you're providing a port, an airport, roads, and you're providing infrastructure and water for the entire metro region with a very limited kind of population tax base to sustain the quality of those services. So I think a certain kind of challenges here to municipal annexation. And if we had a larger pot, if Essex County were a single kind of pot, and taxes were collected and centrally and distributed across the metro region, there would be opportunities there to kind of move suburban property tax revenue to urban areas and to urban kinds of school districts. But it's challenging. Yes.
Miles, thanks for an excellent presentation. I have a question about people in who are challenged in terms of income living in Newark. And there's not a situation around intergenerational wealth that often benefits people who are not Black or not Hispanic, where people are just more comfortable. And so people become more vulnerable to shocks in the economy. And where people are living in red line neighborhoods, they're not earning money on flipping their houses because those houses tend to stagnate in terms of housing value. Do you see research on that, on the impact of the fact that people are basically starting over all the time, essentially, and how that kind of keeps places like Newark in the same boat over time? You know, the fact that you don't have the intergenerational wealth or having families helping families to weather shocks, for example, in the real estate market.
I think that there's several things. There's homeownership capital, the wealth that comes with homeownership. There's financial capital. I think that there's also certain kinds of what I would call like cultural capital. So the kind of certain benefits of homeownership, that if you are a homeowner, there are certain neighborhoods where you can kind of live, and those neighborhoods might have a better school district, and those school districts can allow your children to go to college, to kind of have certain kinds of job skills that help them in the workplace, or be able to go to school with wealthier kind of a more selective kind of a peer group. I think that's something that produces another kind of intergenerational wealth. I don't know how to quantify that kind of intergenerational wealth, the value of a college education or a better education. But I think it's one contributing factor. And these things are so kind of interwoven in the sense that we've locked the best school districts behind areas that are majority homeowner. And so to send your child to that school district, you have to become a homeowner in that neighborhood. So I don't know how to kind of fully pull it apart. I think the other thing is to look at differences in not just intergenerational wealth, but what are differences in kind of income? What kind of jobs are available in Newark? What kind of jobs are available in suburbs where people can easily drive to work? It's complicated. Yeah.
Elizabeth Dennis asks, what role does gentrification have in urban renewal?
When it comes to gentrification and urban renewal, gentrification is more of a 1970s to present kind of term to describe this kind of idea of return to the city, urban kind of economic growth and rebirth. In the 1950s, some of the urban renewal projects do attempt to bring about gentrification. So for instance, the Pavilion and Colonnades in Newark, or Lafayette Park in Detroit, or Lincoln Center in New York City, what these projects attempt to do is they attempt to take a low-income neighborhood, clear it of residents, and put in what the state feels is a more desirable kind of land use, in the hope that this more desirable land use generates more property tax revenue for municipal services. And so I see they don't call it in the 1950s gentrification, they just call it urban renewal. But I think that the attempt in a lot of these urban renewal projects is to retain the kind of wealth and the kind of large numbers of middle class and wealthy people in Newark in the 1970s, the city might have had in the 1920s. So I think it's really a response to population flight, an attempt to stop population flight, and obviously that disproportionately targets and harms the low-income communities of that city.
I have a lot of experience in researching my family and when they left Newark on all this subject. They were all out by the 1920s. They all had cars before that. You talk about the cars being the means for leaving, but you didn't say why they left. The family all left because they wanted more land. Some wanted more land, so they went further out. Some settled for South Orange, a bunch settled for Maplewood. But if you wanted more land, you had to go further out to Short Hills to get the land. Wanting more land was also a lot of the part of the deindustrialization. Yes, you had, no unions in the South, but the buildings, you said there were 2 or 3 stories. There were more like 4 stories. And they were long and narrow because you had a power shaft running down the building to drive everybody's machines. And you had all the stuff going up and down elevators. Very, very inefficient. So by moving somewhere else where you could spread the whole thing out on one level and use, forklifts to move everything all around. Yeah. So land was there. You mentioned the interstates. I don't think the interstates had anything to do with getting people to leave. It certainly displaced people by where they built them, including displacing a warehouse my father owned, which he lost to the highway. And so I think the flight by the 67 after that was nothing to do with highways, but had to do with, the riots and the reputation and not wanting to live there anymore.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. I do think that some of these things happened with or without the Great Migration. So the movement of factories from the city to the suburbs, as you mentioned, happens because certain changes in manufacturing. In the 1890s and 1910s, most of these are kind of steam shop factories driven by powers and drivetrains that need to be near the source of power to kind of power it. In the 19th century, these are mills, and you need to be near the mill to kind of get access from the water to power the looms. When you have electricity, you can have a large distributed factory floor over a large area. If you're making multiple kinds of products and you're changing what you make every year, you need to constantly move around and rearrange the machines on the assembly shop floor. So I think a large amount of that deindustrialization happens with or without the Great Migration. So I think it's a good counterfactual. And it is true that a large amount of suburban development is driven by the desire for land. And I think part of these are certain kinds of cultural norms. If you look at how the suburbs are advertised, how they're marketed, if you look at Leave It to Beaver, mid-century television shows, I'd say that a lot of them, they advertise a certain kind of way of life that's very American. Sesame Street that shows brownstones on every building is not the average television show. It's more like Simpsons, Family Guy. So I think even today in kind of popular culture, the suburb is represented as the prototypical American dwelling. So I don't know how much to attribute that to suburbanization, but I would say that suburban development is a product of certain kinds of cultural norms that shape our expectation of what is normal or shape our expectation of how much land a family should live on.
A question from a Zoom participant. What is the most important thing we can do or ask the city and state governments to do to reduce the wealth gap in Newark? More of a public policy question than
That's a question. I don't know. I think a lot of it requires significant changes to the state and federal level. I think it requires enabling legislation from the state to tax parking lots at a higher development to incentivize development in downtown Newark. Currently, we have a property tax rather than a land tax, which assesses the amount of tax you pay based on how much you build, rather than a land tax, which is kind of a flat. You pay the same fee regardless if it's a parking lot or a 20-story building there, so it incentivizes development. But currently, the property tax system, as you pay more taxes, the more you build. And so that's a way to kind of degrowth or discourage density, and the idea that you can go to the suburbs, pay lower property taxes. I think it'd be beneficial for Newark to maybe charge more land taxes, to charge higher fees to parking lots, to encourage the development of 300 plus acres of parking in downtown Newark. Some of these are within the power of City Hall. I think other things are not, and require changes in state policy and federal policy.
Yeah, I just have a couple of comments. One, in terms of the language used. First of all, I want to appreciate your presentation and your passion behind doing that. Having grown up in the city of Newark and everybody talks about the school district, that's an easy fix. I'm actually a product of the Newark Public Schools, and I can tell you I went on to go to law school. But it wasn't because the school was providing, it was we had some cultural protections and, you know, people were helping us out. So I think that there's an easy fix to the school system. The question is, do we have the political will or the public will to do something? If the students in the public school in Newark, since I was there and before, got the same attention and were valued the same way as they are in the suburbs, those students would do well too. I'm a retired professor. And a lot of the techniques that people use in wealthier or overprivileged school districts, I used in the classroom with students who couldn't even read at 8th grade. They couldn't read in the 8th grade and they were 30 and 40 years old. Within 15 weeks, they were reading comparable to an attorney, but they required the same kind of attention that you get in urban and wealthier school districts. My question, aside from the language, because you talk about urban renewal, in my community call it Negro removal, right? So, and a lot of people didn't get reimbursed for that. And you talked about UMD&J, which replaced a large black middle class of doctors, lawyers in the area. But my question, I wanted to make those comments, but my question has to do with tax subsidies and corporate subsidies, right? Because the impact that that's going to have on the city. I'm a legacy person. I'm not going anywhere. I lived in the third wealthiest community on the planet, and I came back to Newark because I never wanted to leave. And so, and there are a lot of people like me who want to be here. But I see a little bit, not so much I guess Newark would be part of it. What I see is comparable to what happened when Europe underdeveloped Africa. And I see that happen in the urban cities around this country where they're being underdeveloped for their resources. They don't have the gold and the diamonds, but they have Port Newark and they have Newark Airport and those things being co-opted. So I'm really concerned about the people who stayed here, the legacy people, that if it wasn't for them, there would be no Newark for other people to come to. And the other thing, somebody made the comment about riot. There wasn't a riot. It was a civil disturbance for those who didn't really understand. And it was a rebellion to the conditions that existed before them. No reflection on you. You did an excellent job, but I think we need to look at the language because it says, but you did a good job. I would call the language neutral, but I understand your audience. So. But in terms of tax subsidies and corporate subsidies, because that's ultimately going to have an impact on the residents here who pay taxes. The average rent is like $1,500 a month. The average salary, the last time I looked at the last census, was $37,000. We talk about low income people. They're really working class low income people. So we need to make sure, otherwise people have a perception that they don't work, and they do work 2 and 3 jobs. And we need to be mindful of that. So if you could speak to the corporate subsidies and the tax subsidies and what impact it's going to have on senior citizens who are trying to hold on to their homes so that they can pass them down to their, the next generation. But thank you again for the work you've done.
I think it's...
Miles, we have a question from Peter Shapiro. Do you see the pattern with Hispanic residents and their movements more like European immigrants or more like Blacks? We note that many New Jersey suburbs now have significant Hispanic population. Have you done enough research on recent demographic changes or movements to comment on that?
That's a good question. I don't know the immediate answer. I will say that Hispanics have only been on the U.S. Census since the year 1970. I think it's kind of a question up for debate. Whether or not Hispanic populations follow the trajectory of Italian and earlier groups or Jewish groups and become assimilated into the American mainstream or not. I don't know the answer to that. But in response to the question of subsidies, I think it is problematic that we place so much of the development in downtown Newark on a key few actors. I think about the size of the subsidy that was offered to Amazon to come to Newark, $27 billion with 26,000 jobs. Had that been distributed as to 100 small businesses or even 1,000 small businesses, how much of an impact that could have made. My concern about subsidies is when they raise the cost of development for everyone else. If I'm a large actor and the federal government is giving me a 10% tax amount off, or I get a tax write-off, it increases the cost of development for everyone else. It's an uneven playing field. So I think my concern is not with tax abatements, but how they are distributed equitably or inequitably. The Newark of the 1910s and 1920s was a city of small industries, small businesses. Newark was never a city like Detroit that was centered on one or two key industries. Newark had thousands of small businesses, and I think they were the backbone of the city's economy. So I wouldn't hinge the revival of Newark on one or two companies, on just Amazon or just Audible. I'd hinge it on a whole range of companies, large in number and many of them small in number. And I think it's important for federal subsidies to be targeted towards small businesses. Prudential got $200 million for their headquarters on Broad Street, and they got $200 million to move their headquarters from the Gateway Center to Broad Street. That is an incredible amount of money that, if given as a tax subsidy, could have been given to 200 small businesses to relocate to Newark. I think that's another concern.
Hi, how you doing?
Hello.
First off, I want to say thank you for your presentation. I thought it was really well. I thought it was very well put together. Two-part question, right? So in history, was there ever a point in time where there was incentive for high salaries in Newark? Because we all know, like, there's a income problem in Newark for people to even afford houses. And also today, are there incentives for companies that come here, like Audible, Prudential, and even Lionsgate in the next 2 years? Are there incentives for them to hire Newark residents for reasonable salary, that where there could be improvement in the income problem?
I think a key issue is that there's a large number of jobs in the metro region, but many of them are spatially inaccessible. That if having a good job requires owning a car, that's a significant kind of barrier to homeownership, or not just homeownership, I think to wealth building too. That in the 1900s, if you can just commute to work with a 5 or 10 cent trolley and nickel fare, there's very little cost to kind of commuting to work, and there's some spatial mobility within the small metro area. I think there's any number of good paying jobs in suburban areas, in wealthier communities, but whether or not they're spatially accessible is another matter. If NJ Transit doesn't give easy transit access to those suburban communities, that's a problem. If it's a 40-minute bus ride, that's a problem. That's significant cost in time and in energy. So I think the challenge there is kind of two-part, both for more jobs in Newark, but also making more jobs available in suburbs. That requires changes in how we're funding mass transit, maybe increasing federal subsidies for mass transit, increasing federal investment in building mass transit lines, trolley lines to connect to suburban areas. And when it comes to the issue of housing affordability, the 1930s and 1940s in Newark, particularly after World War II, there's a significant housing crunch. And it's a pretty low vacancy rate in housing just after World War II. That starts to kind of trickle off largely through suburbanization, where the federal government builds all these homes in suburbs to kind of reduce the urban vacancy rate. But I think you ask a challenging question, and I think mass transit is one of the answers.
Miles, we have, looks like about 3 questions, at least you can draw from them, about corporate ownership of homes in Newark. Heard Noel Lorraine Williams saying that nearly half Newark homes are owned by corporations, and Lenny Thomas adding homes that are being bought up by corporate developers to build more company style of housing. In your research, have you, again, this is perhaps more recent than the period that you're looking at, but have you looked at corporate ownership of housing and homes in Newark?
I can't say if I've looked as much into corporate ownership of homes in Newark. I think that there is a challenge in what the federal legislation is allowed or not allowed to do. That there's no way for the federal government to put a deed restriction and saying, you know, a New York resident can only sell or that can only become homeowner or homeowner occupied. I don't know what the solution to that is. And I think it's one of the key issues in New York. If you look at that earlier graph, the homeownership rate in New York has always been pretty low, under 30% historically. And so there's few opportunities for homeownership and fewer still with corporate ownership of homes. I don't know the exact number. I'd have to look at the climate study to see how much that number has increased over the past 10 years. But I don't know what the solution to that is.
Oh, hello. Hi.
Hello.
I have a question for you. First of all, I caught the tail end of your program, but what I saw was phenomenal. So thank you very much for your insightful research. I have a question though. I used to work in Harlem before the empowerment zone happened, and people were displaced from Harlem once other people started moving in. Things changed. I lived in Brooklyn, and then gentrification happened in Brooklyn. So now I'm here in Newark, New Jersey, and I see things changing here as well as things gentrify. Are there any systems in place, or has any thought been put into how they're going to help the people here hang on to their homes so they are not displaced as well as prices go up?
I don't know what actions Newark City Hall is taking. I do have concerns about the affordable inclusionary zoning ordinance. I am concerned that if the inclusionary zoning ordinance determines area median income by Essex County, the area median income in Essex County is about $100,000. And if the 20% set aside for inclusionary zoning is calculated by the area median income for the region to include Essex County suburbs, it's significantly higher than the median income in Newark. Whereas I think if the AMI for the inclusionary zoning ordinance were calculated by the area median income for Newark, it would require developers to build a housing stock that is within the price point of Newark residents and not taking the average for the larger region. So I think certain details like that can encourage those kinds of opportunities in Newark. I think gentrification is a real issue that we're struggling with. I think 30 and 40 years ago, Newark City Hall has the lower advantage. Newark has to accept whatever developers come their way. I think increasingly we're living in a period in downtown Newark where the city can really fully leverage its own power to say that if we can negotiate with the developers on our terms, and that if we can say no to them because someone will also come along and build something. I think 30 years ago, those opportunities are fewer. Today, I think it's opportunity and it's time for our city officials to really negotiate with developers more strongly and to give fewer kinds of tax abatements and subsidies to encourage them to come to Newark. And so I don't think we can stop gentrification. We need some income diversity in Newark, but neither should we create these kinds of policies that outwardly encourage it. And that there should be more tax abatements and subsidies specifically for owner-occupied developments. We don't have to give a tax subsidy if it's just rental. We can give it if there's more condos, more other kinds of developments there. I think that by selectively offering benefits, we can more readily encourage certain kinds of developments instead of just giving it to anyone who comes along. I think gentrification isn't something you stop, but I think it's something you negotiate and manage to find the best kind of balance there, because you need an income diversity in Newark, but you don't want that income diversity to come at the cost of displacement. And I think that balance is possible, but it's something that we as a country are really struggling with.
Good evening. My name is James Holloway. I reside in this neighborhood, and I've been here a little over 70 years. My family migrated to Newark from the state of Georgia, so I'm a deep Southerner. But before I go into that, I want to recognize the mother and father of this young man. They've done an outstanding job. Yeah. Let me just one see. And let everyone see. These two people did an outstanding job and created a gym here. And he's going to be a part of this neighborhood with us. And we think very highly of this young man. I came here, and let me tell you something. I saw two types of racism. I moved on my block. I think there was one other, no, they were mostly Irish and Italian. When I moved on that block, I couldn't figure out what happened. Everybody's leaving. So I faced two kinds of racism. I faced the racism in Georgia, and then I came here and I couldn't figure out, well, what did we do to these people? I mean, we worked. My father bought his home. As a matter of fact, I worked and I bought 5 homes because I have 5 children. I have one home for each one of my children. Now, I'm not an eloquent speaker because my training was mostly in vocational stuff. My wife asked me many a time, she said, "When are you going to decide what you want to be?" Because I've trained in every vocation there is. And still today, at 77, I can't do what I used to do, but I try. But I want to tell you, those blacks that ran away from the city and left us here, I didn't think much of those people. I was wondering, I said, if you go up there and times get tough, you're going to run from there as well. Maybe it's why they don't want you there, because you're not going to stand tall. I'm happy for those that came back and are working with us and helping us. And yes, the highways. Oh, let me say this about before I go to the highways. The Southern Caucasian folks didn't mind living next door to me, just as long as I didn't do better in life than they did. When I came here, you didn't want me next door. I devalue your neighborhood. And I work hard every day for everything I get. I serve my country. And I started when I came home from Vietnam in 1967. And where's the young lady? She said it wasn't a riot we had here.
Rebellion.
A
rebellion.
A rebellion. I went home first in my uniform. I had put the only thing in life that I had of any value, my life, fighting where I thought was my country. And I stopped at a little liquor store on my way back to the farm because I come from a dry county. A dry county, there's no alcoholic beverages sold in those counties except bootleg moonshine. And we drank plenty of that. But I went into this little liquor store and the cashier was over in the, I could see him through the door. He's over behind the bar in the white bar. And he didn't pay any attention to me standing. So I went out the door and I came back in the white bar. Oh, it got real quiet. But I walked up to the bar. I'm a combat soldier. I can walk up here boldly. And he says, "Can I help you?" I told him, "Yes, I want to get a bottle of vodka." He said, "You're going to have to go around the back here, and they got a hole cut in the wall, and ring the bell there or knock on the door, and I'll hand it out to you." I said, "Oh, wow, this is something." In 1967, you're asking me to go to the back door? And especially when you see me with my uniform on? He says to me, he says, I don't know who you've been talking to out there, and I don't rightly give a damn. Pull out his gun, and he says, you better get your black ass out of here. Just the way he said it to me. Fine. I jump back in my car and leave. I won't spend no vodka money here today. That's the type of racism we had down there. I worked in those tobacco fields, in those cotton fields. And we had a farm about 100 acres, and we had about 60 acres under cultivation with mules. We didn't have money to buy tractors, trucks, and cars. But we were rich, and I didn't even realize it. Because on that farm, we had everything we needed to sustain life. I came here, and I got a job. I think they might have started me out with $10 an hour, maybe. And all my neighbors started disappearing. There was a large contingent of Irish people here on James Street. And this neighborhood was established before our former mayor, Ken Gibson, decided he would join in clearing this neighborhood out, gentrification, and he brought in others. I had bitter, sweet emotions about that because you broke up a community that was good. Today, we have every ethnic group right here in this community. We have a nice, strong community organization called the Historic James Street Commons Neighborhood Association. And we don't fight. I could sit with Zamin or Ann and tell them I got 3 boys, 2 girls. You should pass them off to me as well. I like this young man. Miles, back in '65, I really started watching the effects of these interstate roads going through our community. At that time, 280 only ran from Orange Street to Harrison Avenue. And all up that 280, those were all ratables. People I would attend school with, people I knew. And that highway, 280, wiped them out. Just wiped them out. I understand redlining in the neighborhood because I stayed, but I couldn't get a loan for anything. Nothing. It's better, but it's not as good as it should be for me to go to a bank and be accepted and get a loan from a bank. So I have to go to other types of institutions to get my funds and pay a lot more. But no matter how many roads you build, it's not going to run me out of Newark. Everywhere I go, and I've done quite a bit of extensive travels. And when I return to Newark, each time Newark looks better and better to me. Let me say this, and I give this mic up to someone else. We had these high-rise project complexes in the city of Newark. We learned that they don't work. When you stack people 15, 16 stories high, those are not a good atmosphere in there. And today we're going right back to that same mistake. They want to put a 45-story tower here. I don't even know how a fire department would ever service that building if there's ever a fire. So everything is going to the sky. And we know that won't work. As soon as these predator developers take their money, get their money out of that building, they're gone. Same thing happened here when we brought the new people into this community. There was a stipulation when you went in the lottery and you were fortunate enough to get one of these houses on James Street. One of the stipulations was that you had to reside in that property for 5 years before you could dispose of it. It was like clockwork. They had to be counting the days on when the 5 years came, they took off. But they kept their property, so it's just a piggy bank for them. But they never come down, and we find that absentee landlords are the worst. They don't care about the trash in front of their doors. But the homeowners, we care. And why should the tenants care? It's not theirs, and the landlord is never going to come and do anything for them. But I just thought I'd like to share some of that because I could go on and ramble all night with you. So I like these conversations. But I'm not angry with anyone. I don't know why you would be angry with me and why you would want to run from. I just want to be your friend and your neighbor.
Well, first, I'd just
Thank
briefly
you,
like to
David.
thank the previous gentleman for his service to our country and for his life's example and for his heart and his soul and his devotion to the highest aspirations of what it means to be a citizen of this country. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. And then I would just briefly like to ask, I recently just embraced, 55 plus, so I can go to the museum now and take, little courses. But I also went to, this is really something, but I joined a friend who was a mall walker the other day, and I live in Clifton, and Miles and I are friends, and we talk about public transportation all the time. And my friend lives in Verona. She picked me up, and we went out to that American Dream, that big atrocity in the marsh. And we walked around, and it wasn't any surprise to me, but of course they're not filling up any of the space. There's a lot of vacant. You walk through that thing, and it's a behemoth. In the process of doing that, I realized, as I have before with Jersey Gardens, how did this happen? How did this American Dream thing, how do we repeat the same thing that happened in the 60s and 70s with this decentralized suburbanization shopping mall nightmare constructed on the fringe of, by the way, Passaic, Clifton, and Patterson, which, by the way, furnish American Dream with its entire workforce, and they're all coming by substandard bus transportation. What is it going to take to get our mayors to act in a concerted way across the state, instead of seeing their municipalities as fiefdoms, to sort of think about regionalizing planning and then redistributing such retail concentrations in places like Passaic and Patterson and Clifton and Newark?
I'll just go quick response. I think that the only real source of economic development is people power. And I mean that genuinely. I don't think the renaissance of Newark starts when Prudential or Audible or any other major developer comes to town. I think it starts with the Ironbound and the significant changes in immigration in Newark since the 1960s. And with those groups and their work that paved the framework for whatever developer, that made it desirable for developers who want to come here in the first place. And so I think that those subsidies should be developed to homeowners, and they are the center of any city's future and rebirth, and the rebirth of downtown. And American Dream is a bankrupt mode of development, and it should not be replicated anywhere. And we need to return to that image of a walkable downtown Newark in the 1920s with Bamberger's and Hanes and all the department stores and the range of businesses there. And I think sometimes we can look to history to find more sustainable or more walkable forms of urban development and the urban form.
I think, Miles, would you be willing, there are some other questions, and maybe you'd be willing to handle the one-on-one.
Sure.
But I think we do want to give Miles a thanks for this presentation tonight and wish him well and wish you